He wasn't a gangster. He never carried a gun, never ordered a hit, never buried a body in the swamps of Jersey. And yet, every gangster in New York feared him. His weapon wasn't bullets. It wasn't muscle. It was paper. Paper and ink. Files stacked in locked cabinets. Folders crammed with names, dates, photos, whispers of crimes too dark to print. His name was Roy Cohn. The mob called him their lawyer. Judges called him untouchable. Politicians called him, when they were desperate. Roy Cohn lived by one rule: never apologize. Never lose. From the smoky hearing rooms of Washington, D.C. to the back alleys of Little Italy, his shadow stretched across America. He could save you from prison, or put you in one. He didn't need the mob. The mob needed him. But secrets have a weight. And Cohn carried too many. Too many files. Too many names. Too many enemies waiting for their chance. Tonight, we're going to tell his story. The story of the lawyer who terrified the mob, bent the law to his will, and built an empire of secrets so powerful, it eventually destroyed him. The Bronx, 1927. A newborn cries inside a 3-story brick townhouse on 182nd Street. His name is Roy Marcus Cohn. To the neighbors, he's just another Jewish baby in a crowded borough of New York. But inside that house, his parents already whisper about destiny. His father, Judge Albert Cohn, is a towering man with a stern jaw and the kind of voice that silences a room. He is respected in New York's Jewish community, feared in political circles, and well connected to Tammany Hall, the machine that runs city politics. His word can make or break a career. His rulings echo through courthouses downtown. His mother, Dora Marcus Cohn, is a different force entirely. Sharp, calculating, and fiercely ambitious, Dora treats her son less like a child and more like an investment. She doesn't cradle him softly. She molds him, sharpens him. From the time he can speak, she tells him, "Roy, you are destined to be powerful. Never let anyone walk over you. Never lose. And never, ever say sorry." Early childhood, a weapon in training. Roy grows up in a household where failure is not allowed. Other kids run the streets of the Bronx, playing stickball, getting into fistfights, laughing under fire escapes. Roy spends his afternoons inside, listening to his father dissect court cases. He learns early how to argue. Not the way children argue, screaming, stomping, sulking. Roy argues like a lawyer. He listens for weakness, finds the crack, and drives the knife in. By the time he's 10 years old, he can outdebate adults twice his age. Teachers call him brilliant, but unsettling. He's too sharp, too ruthless. When another student beats him on a test, Roy doesn't sulk. He whispers rumors about the boy cheating, planting doubt until the teacher questions everything. Even as a child, he knows, the truth doesn't matter. What matters is leverage. Teenage years, outsider and insider. By his teens, Roy is short, pale, awkward. He's not athletic, not charming, not the kind of boy who wins friends on the playground. But what he lacks in warmth, he makes up for in calculation. He studies people the way some boys study baseball cards. He knows who's weak, who's vain, who can be pushed. His father's connections give him access to powerful rooms, courtrooms, back offices, political dinners. While other Bronx boys dream of becoming boxers or ballplayers, Roy dreams of controlling those rooms. He sees how judges, politicians, and gangsters trade favors like currency. He watches men with expensive suits whisper deals over whiskey, and he knows that is the real game. Columbia prodigy. At just 14, Roy enrolls in Columbia College. Imagine it, a boy barely old enough to shave, sitting in lecture halls with men nearly a decade older. He doesn't care if they laugh at him. In fact, he thrives on it. Every smirk is fuel. He devours books on history, politics, and, most of all, law. He studies not to serve justice, but to master it. He learns that the law is not about truth. It's about power. Whoever argues best wins. Whoever controls the evidence controls the outcome. By 20, Roy graduates from Columbia Law School. A boy from the Bronx is now a lawyer in New York City. But he doesn't want to write contracts or handle divorces. He wants something bigger. Something darker. First cases, cutting his teeth. As a young prosecutor, Roy throws himself into high-profile cases. He prosecutes suspected communists, draft dodgers, and racketeers. He's relentless in the courtroom, interrupting, humiliating, twisting words until the jury sees things his way. He isn't interested in fairness. He's interested in winning. And he wins often. Older lawyers complain about his arrogance, but judges can't ignore his results. In one case, Roy manages to convict 4 accused spies on the flimsiest of evidence. His superiors take notice. Washington, D.C. takes notice. And soon, a call comes that will change his life. Seeds of darkness. At home, Dora beams with pride. Her boy, barely out of college, is already a rising star. But she also warns him, Roy, the world is dangerous. If you want to survive, you must always know something about everyone. Files, names, secrets, that is how you win. It's advice Roy takes to heart. He begins keeping his own folders, notes on judges, prosecutors, politicians. Nothing illegal, yet. Just information. But in Roy's mind, information is ammunition. And he's already stockpiling it. Closing scene of Chapter 1. By the late 1940s, Roy is no longer the awkward Bronx boy. He's a 20-something prosecutor with a sharp suit, a sharper tongue, and a growing hunger for power. He's not content to argue cases in dingy courtrooms. He wants the big stage. That stage will come in Washington, D.C., in the Senate chambers of Joseph McCarthy. There, Roy will learn the true art of weaponizing fear. There, he will step out of the Bronx forever, and into the shadows of American history. Washington, D.C., 1950. The capital is buzzing with paranoia. The Cold War is heating up, and the word communist is enough to ruin a career, a family, a life. Headlines scream about spies, traitors, infiltrators. America is looking for enemies everywhere, under beds, behind curtains, inside classrooms. Into this fever steps Joseph McCarthy, a brash senator from Wisconsin. And by his side, barely 23 years old, is a lawyer from the Bronx with a sharp suit, sharper eyes, and a hunger that can't be hidden. His name, Roy Cohn. The Rosenberg Trial. Before McCarthy, Roy makes his name on a case that electrifies America, the Rosenberg Trial. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, accused of passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets. A trial that would decide not just their lives, but the nation's sense of safety. Roy isn't the lead prosecutor, he's just a junior. But in court, he acts like a general. He pushes for harsher questioning, whispers strategies, and urges the death penalty. Later, critics claim Roy exaggerated his role, even lied about convincing the judge to seek execution. But one thing is certain, Roy Cohn walked out of that trial a rising star. He was 24 years old, and already had blood on his resume. The Rosenbergs went to the electric chair. Roy Cohn went to Washington. Meeting McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was a senator with a gift for theater. He waved papers claiming to hold lists of communists in government. Sometimes the lists were real. Sometimes they weren't. It didn't matter. What mattered was fear. McCarthy needed a lawyer who could match his aggression. Someone ruthless. Someone brilliant. Someone who didn't care about rules, only about results. He found that man in Roy Cohn. Cohn became McCarthy's chief counsel in 1953. For the next 2 years, the Senate was his hunting ground. He grilled witnesses, shredded reputations, and turned hearings into public spectacles. Television cameras caught it all. America watched. America trembled. The bulldog. Roy thrived on it. He didn't just ask questions, he attacked. He leaned forward, eyes flashing, voice dripping with contempt. He called men traitors to their faces, humiliated generals, destroyed careers with a single exchange. Witnesses left the stand in tears. Reporters whispered about his savagery. Even McCarthy called him his bulldog. Cohn relished the nickname. He saw the hearings not as law, but as war. And in war, the goal isn't justice. It's victory. The lesson of fear. In Washington, Roy learned his most valuable lesson. Information is power, but fear is currency. If you had a file on a man, an affair, a debt, a careless remark, you could control him. If you didn't have a file, you could make one. Rumors worked just as well. Truth was optional. Fear was not. Roy began keeping files of his own. Names of senators, staffers, lobbyists. Whispers about their drinking, their lovers, their secrets. Washington was full of secrets, and Roy Cohn collected them like gold. The Army-McCarthy hearings. The climax came in 1954. The Army-McCarthy hearings. McCarthy accused the U.S. Army of harboring communists. The Army fought back. Cameras rolled as the showdown played out live on national television. For weeks, America watched Roy Cohn sit at McCarthy's side, his thin frame rigid, his eyes darting like a hawk. He grilled generals, threatened officers, and demanded names. But the tide was turning. The public was growing weary of witch hunts. McCarthy came off as paranoid, unstable. And Roy Cohn? He came off as cruel. The final blow came when Army Counsel Joseph Welch, his voice trembling with fury, turned on McCarthy and Cohn. "Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" The words echoed through the chamber. The gallery erupted in applause. McCarthy was finished. And with him, Roy Cohn's Washington career crumbled. The reputation. But if McCarthy was destroyed, Roy Cohn was only bloodied. He left Washington with something more valuable than prestige, a reputation. He was now known as a man who could terrify witnesses, bend hearings to his will, and dig up secrets on anyone. He was ruthless, fearless, and, most importantly, available. Mafia bosses took notice. Billionaires took notice. Politicians in New York took notice. Roy Cohn was exactly the kind of man you wanted when the law came knocking. Or when you wanted to knock on the law. Seeds of the mob's lawyer. The hearings ended, but the lesson remained burned into Roy's mind. The law is a stage. Truth doesn't matter. Fear wins. He returned to New York not as a fallen aide, but as a weapon for hire. Soon, his new clients would not be senators or generals, but mob bosses and billionaires. Chapter closing scene. Picture it, a young Roy Cohn, barely in his late 20s, stepping off a train at Penn Station. Washington has spit him out, but New York is waiting with open arms. He carries no gun, no badge, just a briefcase. Inside, files, names, secrets. The boy from the Bronx is coming home. And this time, he's not playing politics. He's about to become something far more dangerous. The lawyer every mobster in New York fears, and every politician can't live without. Washington had turned its back on Roy Cohn. The Army-McCarthy hearings had ended in humiliation, not just for Senator McCarthy but for the young lawyer who had once been hailed as his bulldog. By 1954, McCarthy was a pariah, censured by the Senate, stripped of his influence. Cohn was only 27, but the Capitol already saw him as toxic. His name was whispered with disdain in Georgetown parlors, his face avoided in Senate hallways. But Roy Cohn didn't break. He never did. If Washington didn't want him, then fine, he would go back to New York, the city that birthed him, the city where money and secrets flowed thicker than blood. In many ways, Washington had been nothing but a rehearsal. New York would be his true stage. The train ride back to Penn Station was quiet, but Roy's mind wasn't. He stared out the window, watching the blur of countryside slip by, thinking of everything he had learned in those hearings. The law wasn't about justice. It was about power. The courtroom was theater, the audience the public, and the prize was fear. He had perfected the art of humiliation, of breaking a man not with bullets but with questions, with insinuations, with files. He would bring that art home to Manhattan. When he stepped off the train, he wasn't defeated. He was reborn, building a new fortress. Cohn set up an office in Midtown Manhattan. Not in a grand skyscraper with polished brass and sweeping marble lobbies, but in a modest suite filled with dark wood furniture, thick curtains, and, most importantly, filing cabinets. Row after row of steel drawers. From the beginning, Cohn's law office looked less like a legal practice and more like an intelligence bunker. Clients started coming. At first, they were men on the fringes, small-time businessmen with tax problems, local politicians caught in scandals, nightclub owners looking to grease the right palms. But word traveled fast. The young lawyer from the McCarthy hearings, the one who could reduce a general to stammers, was now available for hire. Cohn didn't advertise in the traditional sense. He didn't need to. His reputation was his calling card. He was ruthless, connected, and fearless. He knew which judges could be leaned on, which cops could be bought, which prosecutors were vulnerable. If you had a problem, Roy Cohn didn't just solve it, he buried it. Crossing paths with the underworld. It didn't take long for the mob to notice. By the late 1950s, New York's underworld was shifting. The Great Five families, Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, Colombo, were fighting for slices of the city's golden pie. Construction, unions, gambling, drugs. Money poured in, but so did federal investigations. The mob had muscle, but what they needed was insulation. Someone who could shield them from subpoenas and indictments. That someone was Roy Cohn. He began taking meetings in the back rooms of Italian restaurants in Little Italy, in smoke-filled offices above Brooklyn docks, in shadowy midtown lounges where gangsters sat with their backs to the wall. He was not intimidated. In fact, he thrived in their company. Where Washington had seen him as reckless, the mob saw him as perfect. He was a man who understood fear. He was a man who could weaponize secrets. And most importantly, he was a man who didn't flinch. Cohn represented bosses like Carmine, Lilo, Galante, and Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno. But his value wasn't just in defending them in court. He was a bridge. He connected mobsters to businessmen, businessmen to politicians, politicians back to mobsters. He created a web where favors moved in circles, always returning to him. The art of the fix. Cohn quickly became known as a fixer. Not just a lawyer, but a man who could make problems vanish. He could arrange a meeting with the right district attorney, whisper in the right ear at City Hall, or plant the right story in a newspaper. If a judge was hesitant, Cohn could find a way to remind him of an indiscretion. If a union leader was stubborn, Cohn could call in a favor from a client who controlled the trucks that delivered his groceries. It wasn't magic. It was leverage. And leverage was the one thing Roy Cohn never ran out of. One story whispered among his clients involved a nightclub owner facing tax evasion charges. The case was airtight until Cohn intervened. Weeks later, the charges were quietly dropped. Nobody knew what file Roy had opened, what phone call he had made, or what promise had been traded. But the owner never questioned it. He paid Cohn's fee in cash, stuffed into a leather briefcase, and walked away free. The files grow. By the early 1960s, Cohn's office was overflowing with files. Not just on clients, but on judges, reporters, police chiefs, even priests. Each file was a shield, a weapon, or a bargaining chip. He didn't just defend his clients. He defended himself, making sure that if anyone ever came after him, he could reach into his cabinet and pull out their worst secret. The files became legendary. Clients joked about them nervously. Rivals whispered about them in fear. Nobody knew exactly what was inside, but everyone believed Cohn had something on everyone. That belief was enough. Social circles of power. Unlike most mob lawyers, Cohn wasn't confined to smoky backrooms and court appearances. He cultivated a glittering social life. He dined with celebrities, through parties attended by artists, bankers, and gangsters alike. In his living room, a judge might sip whiskey beside a mob captain, while a Broadway producer flirted with a socialite. Cohn thrived in these contradictions. He was a man who could attend high mass in the morning, lunch with a Mafia don at noon, and spend the evening at Studio 54 surrounded by glitter and cocaine. To him, there was no difference. Everyone had a secret. Everyone could be useful. The fallen star finds his stage. Washington had cast him out. But New York embraced him. Not in the polite, respectable sense, but in the way a city embraces its necessary evils. Roy Cohn was poison, but poison in the right dose can cure. He kept the machinery running. He protected men who couldn't afford to be exposed, men who needed their hands washed while keeping them buried in dirt. The irony was not lost on him. In Washington, he had destroyed lives in the name of rooting out communism. In New York, he protected criminals in the name of loyalty and leverage. The boy from the Bronx, the bulldog of McCarthy, had become the most feared lawyer in the underworld. Closing scene of Chapter 3. Picture a late night in 1961. Roy Cohn sits alone in his Midtown office. The city outside glows neon, taxis honking below, the hum of New York never stopping. He leans back in his chair, cigarette smoke curling in the dim light. Around him, filing cabinets stretch to the ceiling, each drawer a vault of secrets. He picks up the phone, dials a number from memory, and speaks in his clipped, cold voice. "I hear you've got a problem. Don't worry. We'll fix it." He hangs up, leans back, and smiles faintly. Washington had given him scars. But New York had given him purpose. And with every new file, every new favor, Roy Cohn was weaving a web that no man, not a mobster, not a senator, not a billionaire, could escape. The fallen star had found his stage. And the show was just beginning. New York, early 1960s. The city was booming. Skyscrapers clawed higher into the sky. Broadway lights blazed every night. Wall Street ticked with the steady rhythm of money changing hands. But beneath the glitter and steel, another empire ruled, the mob. The five families carved up New York like a butcher slicing meat, each family guarding its territory with blood and fear. They controlled the docks, the unions, the garbage collection, the construction industry. No building rose without a payoff. No shipment crossed the river without tribute. Politicians whispered their names in backrooms, but never in public. The Mafia was everywhere and nowhere, invisible yet inescapable. And every empire needs a lawyer. A new kind of power broker. Roy Cohn was no ordinary defense attorney. He didn't just appear in court when mobsters were indicted. He worked in the shadows before cases ever reached a judge. He was the man who made calls at midnight, who walked into smoky backrooms, who knew which envelope to slide across the table and which threat to deliver with a smile. Mobsters called him the lawyer who never sleeps. Journalists called him the mob's attorney. Roy didn't flinch at the label. He welcomed it. To him, it wasn't an insult, it was a crown. His clients included the likes of Carmine Galante, Anthony, Fat Tony Salerno, and other figures whose names struck fear even in hardened cops. Roy wasn't intimidated. He sat across from them as equals. They had soldiers with guns. He had files. In the world of power, both were lethal. Courtroom tactics. When cases did go to trial, Roy turned the courtroom into theater. He didn't argue like a lawyer bound by rules. He argued like a predator. He'd shred witnesses, twist testimony, and plant seeds of doubt in jurors' minds. Prosecutors dreaded facing him. Not because they thought he was better at the law, but because they knew he might already have leverage on them. A whispered rumor about a mistress. A questionable donation. A cousin with mob ties. Nobody wanted to be the prosecutor who went up against Roy Cohn and found their own name in the papers the next morning. He rarely won with evidence. He won with intimidation. He won with spectacle. And if that failed, there was always the quiet phone call, the sudden change of heart from a judge, the unexplainable disappearance of a key piece of evidence. The web between worlds. Cohn's genius wasn't just in defending mobsters. It was in connecting worlds that weren't supposed to touch. He introduced mafia bosses to businessmen who needed union peace. He guided politicians toward campaign donations that came from questionable pockets. He helped real estate developers find financing through mob-controlled banks. In return, the mob gave him loyalty. They protected him. They paid him handsomely, sometimes in cash, sometimes in favors. A man like Roy didn't need muscle on the streets. He had something more valuable: access. He could walk into City Hall, into the governor's mansion, even into the White House. The mobsters understood. Power wasn't just violence. Power was connections. And Roy Cohn was the living embodiment of that power. A Night at the Copa. One story from the 1960s captures the essence of Roy's dual life. He's seen at the Copacabana nightclub, sitting at a table near the stage. On one side of him is a Mafia captain, on the other side a senator from New York. Across the table sits a Broadway producer and a Wall Street banker. The drinks flow. The music swells. Deals are whispered in the shadows. Each man leaves the table owing something to the others. And in the middle of it all, Roy Cohn smiles thinly, taking it in. He doesn't need to raise his voice. He doesn't need to close the deals himself. Just by sitting there, he makes the connections possible. That was his genius. He was the bridge. Without him, the mob stayed in the underworld, businessmen stayed on Wall Street, politicians stayed in Albany. With him, they all sat at the same table. The fear factor. But Roy wasn't just a connector. He was a collector. Every meeting, every deal, every whisper was another piece of leverage. He added it to his growing fortress of files. Judges who owed favors. Senators who drank too much. Journalists who took bribes. Mobsters who broke their own codes. All of it went into the cabinets. Soon, everyone assumed he had something on them. And that assumption was almost as powerful as the truth. Fear kept people in line. Fear protected him when prosecutors circled. Fear gave him an aura no gangster could match. Balancing act. Of course, being the mob's lawyer came with danger. The FBI was cracking down. The newspapers were hunting stories. Rival lawyers whispered about his corruption. But Cohn thrived on the edge. He relished the danger. He would walk into federal courtrooms with a smirk, daring the government to touch him. He would host dinner parties where a judge and a mobster shook hands over cocktails, daring anyone to call it what it was. It wasn't that Roy thought he was untouchable. It was that he made himself too dangerous to attack. Anyone who tried would risk having their secrets spilled into the light. The 1970s. A new generation of power. By the 1970s, Roy Cohn's role as the mob's lawyer was firmly cemented. But he was no longer just a mob attorney. He had expanded his empire into politics and business. Real estate developers came knocking, especially a brash young man from Queens named Donald Trump. Trump saw in Cohn a mentor who embodied his own philosophy: attack twice as hard, never admit defeat, never apologize. Cohn took him under his wing, teaching him how to use lawsuits as weapons, how to bend regulators, how to always stay on the offensive. For the mob, for Trump, for politicians, Roy Cohn was the same thing. A shield, a sword, and a vault of secrets. Closing scene of Chapter 4. Imagine Roy Cohn in 1973, standing in his office, the skyline of Manhattan glittering outside. A mobster has just left, a judge is on hold, and a young Donald Trump waits impatiently in the lobby. Roy looks around at the filing cabinets, at the fortress of secrets he has built. He lights a cigarette, exhales a thin cloud of smoke, and allows himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He isn't a gangster. He isn't a politician. He isn't a businessman. But he is all of them at once. The mob's lawyer. The fixer. The man in the middle of every deal that mattered in New York. And as long as he had his files, as long as he had fear, he believed he was untouchable. Midtown Manhattan, late 1970s. The city pulsed with energy, neon lights blazing, taxi horns echoing, the subways rattling underfoot. It was the city that never slept, and no man embodied its restless hunger more than Roy Cohn. His law office on East 68th Street didn't look like the lair of one of the most feared men in America. But inside, behind the heavy curtains and wood-paneled walls, was something far more dangerous than guns or gangsters. Filing cabinets. Rows and rows of them. Steel drawers that groaned with weight. Manila folders packed so tight their seams tore. Envelopes marked only with initials. Photographs tucked between pages of typed notes. These were Roy Cohn's weapons. His fortress. His legacy. The origins of the files. Cohn had started collecting information back in Washington, when he learned that a rumor could ruin a career faster than evidence. By the time he returned to New York, the habit had become obsession. Every client, Every judge, every cop who crossed his path, he kept a file. At first, it was simple. Notes on testimony, newspaper clippings, legal documents. But as his power grew, so did the contents. Soon, the files held secrets no one dared speak aloud. Affairs, bribes, payoffs, hidden bank accounts, quiet addictions. It didn't matter if the information was verified. In Roy's world, truth was secondary. What mattered was fear. If people believed he had something on them, that belief alone gave him control. Fear as currency. By the late 1970s, whispers about Roy's files spread through every corridor of New York power. Politicians joked nervously about them at cocktail parties. Reporters speculated about what they contained. Mobsters warned their soldiers never to cross him, because Roy didn't just bury enemies, he destroyed them with paper. No one knew exactly how many files he had, or what they contained. That was the point. The mystery was the weapon. It made every handshake, every glance from Roy Cohn feel like a threat. One judge supposedly said, half in jest, "I'd rather owe money to the Gambinos than owe a favor to Roy Cohn." Examples of the files in action. There was the city councilman who suddenly stopped pushing an investigation into mob-controlled unions. The reporter who abandoned a damning exposé after meeting with Roy over lunch. The businessman who signed away millions in contracts to avoid a quiet scandal surfacing. Each incident added to the legend. Nobody could prove Roy had pulled the strings, but everyone assumed it. And in New York, assumption was enough. The mob's shield. For the Mafia, Roy's files were priceless. He wasn't just their lawyer, he was their shield. When the FBI came close, when prosecutors circled, Roy could make calls, remind someone of a vulnerable secret, and suddenly the investigation would stall. It wasn't always clean. Sometimes a case still went forward. But even then, Roy's presence loomed. Jurors hesitated. Judges softened. Prosecutors pulled their punches. The mob understood that as long as Roy had his files, they were safer than they would ever be with a dozen gunmen on the street. The double-edged sword. But the files were a burden too. Keeping so many secrets meant Roy had to carry them constantly. In his cabinets, in his briefcase, in his mind. He became paranoid. He trusted few people. He kept backup copies hidden in different locations, never revealing the full extent to anyone, not even his closest friends. And yet, he couldn't stop. The more he collected, the more powerful he felt. The more powerful he felt, the more he needed to collect. It was an addiction as strong as any drug. His enemies said the files would one day destroy him. His allies whispered that they already had, that Roy was a man trapped by his own fortress of secrets. The social theater. Despite the paranoia, Roy remained a fixture in Manhattan's glittering social scene. He held court at Studio 54, mingling with models, artists, and gangsters under the same flashing lights. At his dinner parties, senators rubbed elbows with mob captains, all under Roy's watchful gaze. Everyone laughed, drank, and toasted, but everyone knew, somewhere in those cabinets, Roy had a file with their name on it. And that knowledge changed the air around him. To some, he was magnetic. To others, monstrous. But to all, he was unavoidable. The Trump connection. By now, Roy had taken Donald Trump under his wing. The young developer saw in Roy a mentor who thrived on confrontation, who turned lawsuits into weapons, who never apologized. Trump visited Roy's office, where the cabinets loomed like silent sentries. He absorbed the lesson that in New York, success wasn't about building skyscrapers, it was about controlling fear. Trump once said of Roy, he was a genius. Brutal, but a genius. It was a relationship built not just on business, but on philosophy. And at the core of that philosophy were the files. Whispers of federal fear. Of course, the FBI knew about Roy's files. Agents whispered about them, prosecutors cursed them, and some investigators even admitted privately that the files made Cohn untouchable. No one wanted to risk their own secrets surfacing. Roy delighted in this. He didn't just defend clients. He defended himself by holding the government hostage with the mere possibility of exposure. Too many files. Too many enemies. Too many men afraid of what might leak if Roy was cornered. Closing scene of Chapter 5. Picture Roy Cohn in his office late at night, a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. He sits at his desk, a cigarette burning in the ashtray, a glass of scotch half empty. Around him, the filing cabinets stand like tombstones, silent and heavy with the weight of other people's sins. He opens one drawer, flips through folders, pauses at a photograph clipped to a report. A smirk curls across his lips. He tucks it back inside, locks the drawer, and leans back. In that moment, Roy Cohn is untouchable. Not because of the law. Not because of wealth. But because he knows more about everyone else than they could ever dare to know about him. He whispers to himself, half in jest, half in truth. No one can bury me. I've already buried them all. But what Roy didn't know was that the weight of those files, the secrets, the paranoia, the enemies waiting in silence, was already burying him. By the late 1970s, Roy Cohn was no longer just a mob lawyer. He had become something bigger, something more dangerous. He was the man you called when money and reputation weren't enough. When the law was closing in, when scandal threatened to explode, when you needed a problem not just solved but erased, you called Roy Cohn. He was a fixer. The fixer. The office that never slept. Cohn's office on East 68th Street was a crossroads of desperation and power. The phone never stopped ringing. One call might come from a mob captain facing indictment, the next from a billionaire panicking about a newspaper story, the next from a senator trying to silence an affair. Clients arrived at all hours. Some slipped in the back-end trance, hats pulled low. Others walked proudly through the front door, daring the world to judge them. In the waiting room, a union boss might sit across from a Broadway star, both avoiding each other's eyes. They had nothing in common, except Roy. He charged obscene fees, but no one complained. Because with Roy, you weren't paying for hours billed. You were paying for survival. The methods of a fixer. Roy's methods were rarely legal, but they were always effective. Sometimes he'd call in a favor from a judge whose secret he held. Sometimes he'd plant a story in a friendly newspaper, shifting the narrative overnight. Sometimes he'd simply pick up the phone, deliver a quiet threat, and watch a problem dissolve. He had no hesitation about using intimidation. One businessman recalled receiving a call from Cohn after refusing a deal. The message was simple: "You'll sign, or I'll destroy you." The businessman signed. Roy didn't just fix problems. He created a reality where the threat of problems disappearing or appearing at his will was enough to keep the rich and powerful obedient. The rich, buying immunity. For the ultra-wealthy of New York, Roy was a kind of insurance policy. A real estate magnate caught skimming profits from union contracts. A Wall Street investor caught in insider trading. A shipping tycoon accused of bribing port officials. They all turned to Roy. He could make federal prosecutors hesitate, make tax auditors look the other way, make stories disappear before they ever hit the front page. And if all else failed, he knew how to drag things out until accusers gave up. Delay was his favorite weapon. "If you fight long enough," Roy once told a client, "the other side gets tired. The law doesn't need truth, it needs stamina." The ruthless, political puppets. Cohn's power extended into politics as well. He cultivated senators, governors, and even presidential candidates. He threw lavish parties where politicians mingled with mobsters under the same chandeliers. To Roy, there was no difference between them. They were all just men with secrets. He became a kingmaker in New York Republican circles, influencing judicial appointments, fundraising, and backroom deals. Some politicians admired his skill. Others feared him. Most needed him. One congressman later admitted, "Roy Cohn scared the hell out of me. I wasn't sure if he could ruin me. But I wasn't sure he couldn't." That was enough. Donald Trump, the protégé. Among all the rich and ruthless who sought Roy's counsel, one stood out, a brash young developer from Queens named Donald Trump. Trump was building his empire in Manhattan, and he needed someone who could protect him from unions, lawsuits, and regulators. He found that in Roy Cohn. Roy became more than Trump's lawyer. He became his mentor. He taught him the Cohn doctrine. Always hit back twice as hard. Never admit you're wrong. Turn lawsuits into weapons. Attack, attack, attack. Trump absorbed it all. Later, when asked about Cohn, he said, he was a genius. Brutal, but a genius. The relationship was mutually beneficial. Roy gained influence in New York's new real estate elite. Trump gained a ruthless protector who could smooth over scandals, crush opposition, and open doors in City Hall. The social chameleon. Cohn thrived in the contradictions of New York. He could spend the evening at Studio 54, surrounded by glitter, cocaine, and celebrities, then rise the next morning to attend Mass with Catholic judges, then host a lunch where a senator and a mobster shook hands over wine. He loved being at the center of it all. His apartment became a stage where power collided. Judges, journalists, artists, and gangsters sipping cocktails together under his roof. Roy orchestrated it like a conductor, pulling strings, whispering deals, always watching. He was never the richest man in the room, never the most famous. But he was always the most feared. Fear and loyalty. Roy demanded loyalty from his clients, but he offered something in return: absolute protection. If you were under his wing, you were untouchable, or at least you believed you were. That belief was enough to keep billionaires writing checks and mobsters sending envelopes of cash. But loyalty to Roy was dangerous too. Once you stepped into his world, you could never fully leave. He knew too much. He had too many files. One former client put it bluntly: working with Roy was like making a deal with the devil. He'd save you, but he'd own you. The price of being a fixer. Behind the glamour, the power, the midnight calls, there was a cost. Roy lived in constant paranoia. His health was beginning to fray. Investigations circled. Journalists dug deeper. Enemies, both in the mob and in politics, waited for their chance. And yet, he couldn't stop. The rush of power was too intoxicating. The knowledge that billionaires and gangsters alike needed him, that senators trembled at his calls, that was his lifeblood. Roy Cohn was not just fixing problems. He was fixing history, reshaping New York one deal, one file, one whispered threat at a time. Closing scene of Chapter 6. Picture Roy at one of his infamous dinners in 1978. The table glitters with crystal glasses, plates of steak and caviar. Around him sit a union boss, a real estate developer, a Broadway star, a senator, and a mob underboss. They laugh, toast, trade favors. And at the head of the table, Roy sits quietly, a cigarette between his fingers, eyes darting from face to face. He doesn't laugh. He doesn't need to. He knows that every man and woman at that table is there because they need him. Because somewhere in those steel cabinets, somewhere in those whispered phone calls, Roy Cohn holds their future. For the rich and ruthless of New York, Roy Cohn wasn't just a lawyer. He was the last line of defense, the fixer of impossible problems. The devil you prayed was on your side. But even devils have their day. And as Roy basked in the glow of his influence, the cracks in his empire were beginning to show. The files that had once protected him would soon become the very weight that dragged him down. New York, mid-1970s. The city was broke, crumbling under crime, debt, and decay. Times Square was a neon wasteland of hustlers and XXX theaters. The subways reeked of graffiti and fear. But in the middle of the chaos, fortunes were still being made. And one young man from Queens wanted his share. His name was Donald J. Trump. Trump was ambitious, brash, hungry. He had inherited a small empire from his father, Fred Trump, apartment complexes in Brooklyn and Queens. But Donald wasn't satisfied with outer borough housing. He wanted Manhattan. He wanted skyscrapers. He wanted his name in lights. To get there, he needed more than money. He needed protection. He needed someone who knew how to fight in the brutal world of New York real estate, where unions, mobsters, bankers, and politicians all had their hands in the pie. He needed someone who didn't play fair. He found that someone in Roy Cohn. The first meeting. The story goes that Trump met Cohn at Le Club, an exclusive Manhattan nightclub where the young developer was trying to rub elbows with the city's elite. Roy, already infamous, sat in his usual corner, short, sharp-eyed, cigarette in hand, surrounded by hangers-on. Trump, tall, confident, with the swagger of youth, approached him. He wanted advice. He had a problem. The federal government had just filed a lawsuit against his family's company, accusing them of discriminating against black tenants. It was a case that could not only cost millions, but also stain Trump's name before he had even truly begun. Roy listened, puffed on his cigarette, and then delivered his verdict. Tell them to go to hell. Don't settle. Hit back twice as hard. Trump was electrified. This was exactly the kind of counsel he wanted. Not caution, not compromise, but combat. From that night forward, Trump and Cohn were inseparable. The mentor and the student. Cohn became Trump's lawyer, fixer, and mentor. He taught Trump his doctrine. Never settle. Settling is weakness. If someone hits you, hit back twice as hard. Never admit you're wrong. Attack, attack, attack. Lawsuits are not dangers. They're weapons. Trump absorbed these lessons like scripture. He loved the way Cohn treated the law not as a system of justice, but as a battlefield. To Trump, Cohn was more than a lawyer. He was the embodiment of power without restraint. Roy was a genius, Trump later said. A brutal genius, but a genius. The housing discrimination case. With Cohn at his side, Trump fought the federal discrimination lawsuit. Most companies would have quietly settled, paid a fine, and moved on. Not Trump. Not with Roy advising him. They counterattacked. They filed motions, delayed hearings, attacked the Justice Department publicly. The case dragged on for years, eventually ending in a consent decree that required Trump's company to make changes but allowed him to claim victory. It was vintage Cohn, turn a potential defeat into a performance of defiance. Trump walked away with his image intact, even enhanced. He had shown he was a fighter. Trump Tower and the mob connection. With Roy's guidance, Trump launched his most ambitious project yet, Trump Tower. The gleaming skyscraper on Fifth Avenue would become the symbol of his empire. But building in New York wasn't simple. The concrete unions were mob-controlled. Construction permits required political favors. Competitors circled, waiting for him to fail. Roy smoothed the way. He connected Trump to the right union bosses, eased negotiations with mob-influenced suppliers, and warded off regulators. Trump Tower rose from the ground not just because of Trump's vision, but because of Roy's protection. Behind the mirrored glass of the tower, the fingerprints of the mob and the shadow of Roy Cohn were everywhere. Lawsuits as weapons. Under Cohn's influence, Trump began to see lawsuits not as risks but as strategies. If a critic emerged, sue them. If a contractor complained, sue them. If the press printed something unflattering, sue them. Roy loved it. He saw in Trump a student who understood his creed perfectly. Together, they filed lawsuits by the dozens, often not to win but to intimidate, to exhaust opponents, to prove dominance. The courtroom became another battlefield where fear and fatigue were the real weapons. Social companions. Beyond business, Trump and Cohn were often seen together in New York's social scene. They dined at 21 Club, lounged at Studio 54, rubbed elbows with celebrities and power brokers. Trump admired Roy's ability to move between worlds. Mobsters, politicians, judges, and artists all in the same room. Roy admired Trump's ambition, his hunger to be bigger than life. It was a symbiotic relationship. Trump gave Roy a glamorous protege to mold, someone who could carry his philosophy into the future. Roy gave Trump the tools to conquer Manhattan. The father figure Roy never was. For Trump, whose relationship with his own father was rooted in competition and coldness, Roy became something like a father figure, but darker, more dangerous. Roy didn't demand obedience. He demanded loyalty. He didn't preach morality. He preached survival. Trump learned not just tactics from Roy, but an entire worldview. The world is ruthless, everyone is out to get you, and the only way to win is to be more ruthless than your enemies. It was a creed Trump would carry for the rest of his life. The beginning of the end. But by the early 1980s, cracks were appearing in Roy's empire. Investigations loomed. His health was secretly failing. Some clients began to distance themselves. But Trump remained close. He still valued Roy's counsel, still called him for advice, still dined with him when others avoided his company. For Roy, Trump was a kind of legacy. Through this protégé, his philosophy would live on, long after his own career burned out. Closing scene of Chapter 7. Picture a late night in 1981. Trump and Roy sit in the dim back corner of a Manhattan restaurant. Trump, tall and brash, leans forward, hungry for the next deal, the next building, the next fight. Roy, smaller, sharper, his face lined with years of battles, leans back with a cigarette, eyes glinting with amusement. Trump asks, "What do I do about them?" Some critic, some lawsuit, some obstacle. Roy smirks, takes a drag, exhales smoke, and says, "Destroy them. That's what you do." Trump nods, absorbing it like gospel. For him, this is not just legal advice. It's life advice. It's the creed of Roy Cohn, the fixer, the mob's lawyer, the man with too many files. And through Donald Trump, that creed would echo far beyond New York, long after Roy was gone. New York, early 1980s. The city was a chessboard, and Roy Cohn fancied himself the man who moved the pieces. Judges, politicians, mob bosses, bankers, celebrities, each one a pawn, a knight, a bishop in his game. And at the center, holding the threads together, sat Roy in his smoke-filled office, surrounded by steel filing cabinets that creaked with the weight of secrets. People talked about the Mafia's 5 families as if they ruled New York. They didn't. Not really. They ruled the streets, the docks, the rackets. But Roy Cohn ruled the space where all those worlds collided. He was the spider. And Manhattan was his web. The fear that held it all together. What made Roy's web so powerful wasn't loyalty, or even money. It was fear. Fear that your name was in one of his files. Fear that the wrong move would end up in the headlines. Fear that a quiet phone call from Roy could ruin a career, freeze a business deal, or turn a prosecutor's glare your way. People didn't just respect him, they dreaded him. A crooked politician could laugh off a mobster's threat, but not Roy's. A mobster could handle a rival's gun, but not Roy's file. Fear was the glue, and Roy spread it liberally. A phone that never stopped ringing. From his modest office, Roy orchestrated a symphony of intimidation and favor trading. The phone never stopped. 1 minute, a union boss needed a case squashed. The next, a billionaire needed a critical permit pushed through City Hall. Then a mob underboss wanted a prosecutor softened. Roy never said no. He didn't need to. For every call, he found a way. Sometimes it was a whisper, sometimes a threat, sometimes a reminder that he knew more than he should. And when favors were traded, the debt always flowed back to him. No problem was too small. No problem was too dirty. If you had money, if you had influence, if you had something worth protecting, Roy Cohn was the man to see. Studio 54 and the velvet rope of secrets. By night, Roy prowled the city's clubs, especially Studio 54, where celebrities, politicians, gangsters, and nobodies collided under strobe lights and cocaine haze. Roy loved the contradictions. One night he might stand in a corner with Andy Warhol and Bianca Jagger. The next he'd be in a booth with Carmine Galanti's soldiers. He wasn't there for the drugs or the music. He was there for the whispers. Studio 54 wasn't just a nightclub. It was a marketplace of secrets. Who was sleeping with whom? Who was laundering money through clubs? Who had debts too large to cover? Roy stored it all, another strand in his web. Politicians in his pocket. Roy was especially skilled at weaving politicians into his network. He knew how to flatter them, how to fundraise for them, how to remind them, subtly, that he had leverage. A photograph here, a receipt there, a whisper from a mobster about a campaign donation. He threw glamorous dinners where senators rubbed shoulders with mobsters under his watchful gaze. He introduced judges to businessmen who needed them. He reminded city officials that without his help, their scandals might not stay hidden. They weren't his friends. They were his pieces. And Roy moved them whenever he liked. The journalists who looked away. Even the press, who should have been his natural enemies, were tangled in his web. Some feared him. Others needed him. He leaked stories when it suited him, buried others when it didn't. He could feed a reporter a scandal about one enemy, while keeping another scandal locked in his files. One veteran journalist later said, "If you crossed Roy, he'd put you in the papers. If you pleased him, he'd keep you out of them." Either way, he controlled the ink. The mobsters who respected him. To the mob, Roy wasn't just a lawyer, he was an equal. He didn't carry a gun, but he carried fear. And that made him more dangerous than a dozen hitmen. He made introductions, smoothed business, and when necessary, he reminded the mob that he knew as much about them as they did about him. It was a delicate balance, too much pressure, and they might turn on him. But Roy was a master at walking the line. He never demanded loyalty. He made himself indispensable. They called him the Sixth Family, half in jest, half in truth. A web that spared no one. What made Roy's web so terrifying was that it spared no one. Billionaires, politicians, mobsters, journalists, they all had strings tied to him. A judge who took bribes from a developer. A banker laundering mob money. A senator with a mistress on the payroll. A celebrity with a drug problem. Roy had files on them all. And if he didn't, he could create one. The fear was enough. The cost of the web. But webs are fragile things. They depend on tension, on the constant pull of threads. And by the early 1980s, Roy's web was straining. Prosecutors were circling, investigating his finances, his clients, his taxes. The FBI wanted to untangle the mob's control of New York, and Roy was at the center of too many connections. At the same time, whispers about his health were beginning. He brushed them off, denied everything, but behind closed doors, he was coughing more, losing weight, tiring faster. Still, he never let the mask slip. In public, he was the same Roy, sharp, ruthless, smirking as if the whole city danced on his strings. Closing scene of Chapter 8. Picture Roy at his desk, the Manhattan skyline glowing beyond his window. The phone pressed to his ear, 3 more lines blinking with calls waiting. Filing cabinets loom around him like silent sentinels. In one night, he talks to a mob boss, a senator, a journalist, and a billionaire. Each conversation ends the same way, the other man saying, "Thank you," with a nervous laugh. Each one knows Roy has power over him. Each one owes him something. Roy hangs up, lights another cigarette, and leans back in his chair. The smoke curls upward, vanishing into the dark. He smiles faintly. The web is strong. Stronger than ever. Or so he tells himself. Because in the shadows, beyond even his reach, enemies are waiting. And even the strongest webs can tear. New York, mid-1980s. For nearly 3 decades, Roy Cohn had been untouchable. He had outlived Joseph McCarthy, outlasted mob wars, and danced circles around prosecutors. Judges feared him, mobsters respected him, billionaires paid him. He carried the secrets of a city in his filing cabinets, and he believed that was enough to shield him forever. But even the sharpest blade dulls. Even the strongest web phrase. And by the 1980s, the cracks in Roy Cohn's empire were beginning to show. Investigations closing in. It started with whispers. The FBI had been building cases for years against New York's mob families, launching Operation Donnie Brasco and the Mafia Commission trial. And everywhere investigators turned, Roy's name appeared in the margins. He wasn't an official member, but he was there, at the dinners, in the contracts, on the phone calls. Federal prosecutors began to wonder, could they bring down the mob's lawyer? Soon, Roy was facing multiple indictments. Bribery, accusations that he had tried to bribe a government official to secure favors for a client. Obstruction of justice, charges that he had tampered with witnesses and manipulated cases. Fraud, allegations of financial misdealings, including tax evasion and forged documents. For most men, these cases would mean ruin. But Roy wasn't most men. He did what he always did. He fought back. He sneered at the charges, mocked the prosecutors, dragged the cases out until they withered. Time and again, he walked out of court acquitted, smirking for the cameras. Yet something was different. Each trial left a mark. Each acquittal felt less like a triumph and more like a reprieve. The aura of invincibility was fading. Journalists on the hunt. The press, once cowed by Roy's threats and favors, began circling again. Young reporters who didn't remember the fear of McCarthyism, who weren't impressed by his name, started digging. They wrote about his mob connections, his political manipulations, his mysterious wealth. One exposé described his office as a fortress of secrets, questioning how a man who claimed to live modestly entertained celebrities and politicians in lavish style. Another piece alleged that Roy kept his enemies close by keeping their secrets closer, hinting at blackmail without saying the word. Roy lashed out, calling them liars, threatening lawsuits. Some backed off, but others pressed harder. For the first time in years, Roy Cohn found himself not in control of the story, but a character in someone else's narrative. Friends who turned away. Worse than the journalists were the friends who began to distance themselves. Politicians stopped taking his calls. Judges declined his dinner invitations. Even mob bosses, sensing his weakening grip, began to wonder if Roy was worth the risk. The web he had spun for so long was unraveling, thread by thread. At Studio 54, where once he had been the dark star at the center of the dance floor, people whispered when he walked by. Some still came to him, but fewer every year. And those who did looked at him not with fear, but pity. Roy despised pity more than anything. Health and denial. Behind the scenes, a more personal battle was brewing. Roy's health was failing. He had been diagnosed with AIDS, though he denied it vehemently, calling it instead liver cancer. In the 1980s, AIDS carried stigma and fear. For a man like Roy, who had lived his life denying vulnerability, who had kept his personal life buried under layers of secrecy, the diagnosis was more than an illness. It was an existential threat. To admit it would be to admit weakness. So he didn't. He worked harder, partied harder, smoked more, drank more. He laughed at rumors, threatened to sue anyone who whispered about his condition. He refused to be seen as dying, even as the disease hollowed him out. The disbarment. The ultimate crack came not from the FBI or the mob, but from the very institution Roy had once bent to his will, the law. In 1986, after years of allegations, the New York State Bar Association finally moved to disbar him. The charges included misappropriation of client funds, lying on court documents, and unethical conduct. For Roy, this was humiliation. He had built his identity around being a lawyer. The lawyer. To strip him of that title was to strip him of his armor. The hearings were brutal. Former clients testified against him. Evidence of forgery and fraud was presented. Roy, once the predator in the courtroom, was now the prey. He raged, denied, threatened, but it didn't matter. The bar voted to disbar him. In private, Roy fumed. To friends, he tried to shrug it off. "I don't need the bar," he said. "I'll always be Roy Cohn." But the truth was clear. The cracks were no longer just hairline fractures. They were gaping wounds. The files losing power. Perhaps most tellingly, the files, his legendary fortress of secrets, were losing their magic. For years, the mere suggestion that Roy had something on you was enough to control you. But by the mid-1980s, the fear had dulled. Some of his enemies had already been exposed. Others no longer cared. And a new generation of politicians and prosecutors didn't believe in the myth. They saw him not as the spider in the web, but as an old man clinging to dusty cabinets. The power that had once kept him untouchable was slipping through his fingers. Closing scene of Chapter 9. Picture Roy Cohn in 1985, sitting in his office late at night. The phone is silent. The once busy lines no longer buzz with desperate calls. The filing cabinets still stand, but they feel heavier now, like tombstones marking a life of secrets. Roy lights a cigarette, coughs, and stares out the window at the Manhattan skyline. Once, this city was his web. Now, it moves without him. For decades, he had built his empire on fear. But fear fades. Secrets rot. And power, once lost, rarely returns. The cracks had appeared. And soon, the whole empire would crumble. New York, 1986. The man who once terrified judges, senators, mob bosses, and billionaires was a shadow of himself. Roy Cohn, once the ultimate fixer, was unraveling. His empire of secrets, built over decades, was collapsing around him. 4 years, Roy had lived on the edge, mocking prosecutors, thumbing his nose at the bar, flaunting his power in public while concealing his vulnerabilities in private. But the cracks had become fractures, and now they were impossible to hide. The disbarment. In June 1986, the New York State Bar officially disbarred Roy Cohn. The charges were humiliating: theft of client funds, lying on court documents, manipulating the legal system for personal gain. Roy fought until the last moment, but the outcome was inevitable. The panel described his behavior as unethical, unprofessional, and unworthy of the profession. For Roy, it was more than a legal defeat. It was an existential one. Being a lawyer wasn't just his job, it was his identity. Without that title, without that shield, what was he? He told the press, with his usual bravado, "What I've done is what lawyers do. If they're going to disbar me for being a successful lawyer, so be it." But behind closed doors, friends saw the truth. Roy was shattered. The illness he denied. At the same time, Roy's body was betraying him. The rumors he had dismissed for years were true. He had AIDS. In the 1980s, AIDS was a death sentence, and worse, it was a stigma. Roy, who had spent his life hiding his sexuality, refused to admit the truth. He told reporters he had liver cancer. He mocked those who suggested otherwise. To admit he had AIDS would mean admitting weakness, admitting vulnerability, admitting a part of himself he had buried beneath decades of denial. But the disease didn't care about denial. It hollowed him out. His once sharp frame grew gaunt. His energy drained. The fixer who never slept, who thrived on confrontation, now struggled just to climb the stairs to his apartment. The desertion of allies. As Roy weakened, his allies vanished. Politicians stopped returning his calls. Judges avoided his dinners. Mobsters, sensing his waning power, drifted away. Even Donald Trump, his protégé, began to keep his distance. The man who had once been the center of every room was now a ghost. Invitations stopped coming. The phone, once his weapon, grew silent. At Studio 54, where he had once reigned like a dark prince, people whispered about him with pity instead of fear. To Roy, that pity was worse than any indictment. The final parties. Still, Roy clung to appearances. He threw parties even as his health declined, gathering the remnants of his old circle: artists, businessmen, a few loyal hangers-on. He poured champagne, smoked, laughed too loudly, insisting that nothing had changed. But it had. Everyone could see it. His face was pale, his hands trembled, his once piercing eyes were dulled by illness. The fixer was fading, and no party could hide it. Reflection in the shadows. In his final months, Roy spent more time alone, surrounded by the very files that had once made him powerful. He would sit in his office late into the night, opening drawers, flipping through folders, smirking at old secrets. But even he knew their power was gone. The world had moved on. Some of the men in those files were dead. Others no longer cared. And the new generation of power players in New York didn't fear him the way the old guard had. The fortress of secrets had become a mausoleum. Death of the Fixer. On August 2, 1986, Roy Cohn died in his Manhattan townhouse. Officially, the cause was complications from AIDS-related illness. To the end, Roy denied it. He was 59 years old. His funeral was attended by a strange mix of people: politicians, mobsters, celebrities, judges. Some came out of loyalty, some out of curiosity, some just to make sure he was really gone. There were whispers at the service, whispers about the files. Where had they gone? Who had them now? Were they destroyed, or were they sitting in another drawer somewhere, waiting to be opened? No one knew. And that uncertainty was Roy's final victory. Even in death, his secrets lived on. Legacy of fear. Roy Cohn's fall was spectacular, but it wasn't clean. He didn't fade quietly. He went out the way he had lived, defiant, unrepentant, ruthless to the last. He had been many things: McCarthy's bulldog, the mob's lawyer, the fixer for the rich and ruthless, the mentor to Donald Trump. He had been feared, hated, admired, envied. But in the end, he was alone. The web he had built collapsed, the power he had wielded evaporated, the secrets he had hoarded turned to dust. What remained was the legend. The stories whispered in courtrooms, in backrooms, in boardrooms. The idea that one man, armed with nothing but files and fear, could bend New York to his will. Closing scene of Chapter 10. Picture Roy's townhouse on the night after his death. The lights are off. The phone is silent. The filing cabinets stand unopened, their steel drawers cold in the dark. 4 decades, they were the heart of his empire. Now, they are just furniture. But somewhere in the city, people still whisper his name. Still wonder if their secrets are buried in those drawers. Still shiver at the thought of Roy Cohn, the fixer who once terrified New York. And that, perhaps, is his final legacy. Not the power he wielded, but the fear he left behind. New York, August 1986. Roy Cohn was dead. The man who had haunted courtrooms, dominated boardrooms, and whispered in the ears of mob bosses and politicians alike was gone. Officially, he had succumbed to complications from AIDS. Unofficially, he had fought death the way he fought everything else, denying it until the very end. But in death, as in life, Roy Cohn left behind more questions than answers. Chief among them, what happened to the files? The funeral of contradictions. Roy's funeral was unlike any other. Held at a synagogue in Manhattan, it drew an eclectic crowd that spoke to the contradictions of his life. Senators sat beside mobsters. Celebrities brushed shoulders with judges. Businessmen whispered nervously in the pews. Some came to mourn, others to celebrate, still others simply to confirm that the bogeyman was truly gone. Donald Trump came, dressed in black, his expression unreadable. 4 years, Roy had been his mentor, his protector, his consigliere. Now Trump stood among the mourners, already calculating how to carry Roy's lessons forward without the man himself. The air was heavy with whispers. People didn't talk about his illness. They talked about the files. The legend of the files. 4 decades, Roy had built his power on secrets. He had collected them relentlessly, on mobsters, on judges, on politicians, on businessmen. His office was a fortress of steel cabinets, each drawer a vault of fear. But after his death, the cabinets were empty. Or at least, that's what people said. Some claimed the FBI seized them in the night, hauling away boxes of manila folders before the funeral was even planned. Others whispered that the Mafia sent men to clean out the townhouse, ensuring nothing incriminating remained. Still others believed Roy had arranged for the files to be hidden, locked away in storage units or passed to trusted allies, a time bomb waiting to explode. The truth never surfaced. And maybe that was the point. The myth of the files was more powerful than the reality. Even in death, Roy Cohn's shadow lingered, because no one knew what he might have taken to the grave, or left behind for others to discover. Fear beyond the grave. What set Roy apart was that his greatest weapon didn't die with him. Fear has a half-life, and Roy's fear lasted years beyond his death. Judges who had once taken his calls flinched when reporters asked about him. Politicians avoided questions, as if speaking his name might conjure a ghost. Businessmen who had depended on him pretended they barely knew him. Even mobsters muttered about the files. Some believed they were gone. Others weren't so sure. And so they lived with the paranoia that somewhere, someone still had their secrets. In that sense, Roy Cohn achieved what few men ever do: immortality through fear. The protégé ascends. For Donald Trump, Roy's death was a turning point. He lost not just a lawyer but a mentor who had shaped his worldview. Yet Trump didn't abandon Roy's philosophy, he doubled down on it. He fought lawsuits with aggression. He treated criticism as war. He embraced the doctrine of never apologizing, never backing down, always hitting harder. In many ways, Roy lived on through Trump. The student carried the master's creed into the future, long after the master's body was in the ground. The mob without its lawyer. For the Mafia, Roy's absence was both a loss and a relief. He had been their shield, their fixer, their bridge to legitimate society. Without him, they were more vulnerable to prosecutors and journalists. But he had also known too much. His death, and the disappearance of his files removed a dangerous liability. No one could be sure what Roy might have revealed if pressed too far. In that sense, his passing was a mixed blessing. The historical reckoning. In the years that followed, historians and journalists tried to untangle Roy Cohn's legacy. Was he simply a corrupt lawyer who thrived on intimidation? Or was he something larger? A symbol of the way power truly works in America, behind the scenes, in whispers and favors and secrets never written down. Books were written. Documentaries were made. His name became shorthand for ruthless tactics, for the dark art of politics and law. To this day, Roy Cohn tactics mean scorched earth aggression, attack, deny, destroy. The disappearance as final trick. Perhaps the most fitting part of Roy's story is that in death, he performed his greatest trick. He disappeared, and so did his files. Unlike McCarthy, whose fall was public and complete, Roy left behind a cloud of uncertainty. Did he really have dirt on everyone? Did he burn the files before he died? Or are they still out there, locked in a dusty storage unit, waiting for discovery? No one knows. And no one may ever know. But the fear that they might exist still lingers in the corners of American power. Closing scene of Chapter 11. Picture Roy's townhouse, days after his death. The curtains are drawn. The rooms are silent. The filing cabinets are open, their drawers empty. Or perhaps not. Perhaps a single drawer remains locked, its key lost. Outside, New York continues to roar, taxis honking, skyscrapers glittering, life moving forward. But inside, the ghost of Roy Cohn remains, whispering from the shadows, reminding the living that secrets never really die. In the end, death did not erase Roy Cohn. It only deepened the mystery. Roy Cohn is gone. Dead at 59, buried in Queens, far from the marble courtrooms and glittering ballrooms where he once thrived. But death did not silence his name. If anything, it amplified it. In the decades since, Cohn has remained a specter haunting American politics, law, and culture, a reminder of how fear, secrets, and ruthlessness can shape a nation. A name synonymous with ruthlessness. Ask 10 people what Roy Cohn meant, and you'll get 10 answers. To some, he was the brilliant young prosecutor who helped convict the Rosenbergs. To others, he was Joseph McCarthy's bulldog, the sneering face of the Red Scare. To mobsters, he was their most reliable lawyer, the man who could make cases vanish. To billionaires, he was the fixer, the insurance policy against disaster. To Donald Trump, he was a mentor, a role model, almost a father. But to nearly everyone, Roy Cohn meant one thing: fear. He had turned fear into currency, intimidation into an art form. And in doing so, he had written himself into American history, not as a hero, but as a dark genius of power. The doctrine of Cohn. Roy's philosophy was simple, brutal, and effective. Never admit guilt. Never apologize. Attack relentlessly. Use lawsuits as weapons, not shields. Collect secrets. Hoard them. Weaponize them. It wasn't just legal strategy, it was a worldview. To Roy, life was war, and the only sin was weakness. He carried that doctrine into every courtroom, every backroom, every dinner party. And he passed it on. Donald Trump adopted it, wielding it in business and later in politics. Others, too, learned from Roy's scorched earth tactics. His fingerprints can still be seen in the way America fights, argues, and governs. The mob without its lawyer. For the Mafia, Roy's death left a void. No other lawyer commanded his mix of fear, connections, and sheer audacity. Without him, mob bosses found themselves more exposed. Federal prosecutors, emboldened, launched sweeping cases like the commission trial that finally crippled the 5 families. Some say that without Roy, the mob lost its shield. And in many ways, it was true. The empire of the underworld cracked just as surely as Roy's own empire had. Politics without the fixer. In politics, Roy's absence was just as keenly felt. He had been a broker of power, the man who could deliver judgeships, who could connect donors to candidates, who could whisper in the ear of a senator. Without him, the Republican circles of New York lost a ruthless operator. But his style lived on. Politicians who had watched him, who had feared him, began to imitate him. Attack, deny, destroy. Cohn's tactics became part of the political bloodstream. The shadow over Trump. Perhaps Roy's most enduring legacy is his influence on Donald Trump. From the 1970s onward, Trump carried Roy's creed like scripture. When criticized, attack. When sued, countersue. When accused, deny everything. Never show weakness. Journalists covering Trump in later decades often remarked, "This is Roy Cohn's playbook." And Trump himself admitted it. "I don't think I would be where I am today without Roy," he once said. In this way, Roy Cohn lived on, not just in memory, but in practice, his doctrine shaping not only New York real estate but the highest levels of American politics. The mystery of the files. And then there are the files. To this day, no one knows what became of Roy's legendary archive of secrets. Some insist the FBI took them. Others claim the mob burned them. Still others believe they're out there, hidden in a storage unit or a basement, waiting to resurface. The truth may never be known. But the myth is powerful enough. The idea that Roy Cohn still has secrets, decades after his death, continues to haunt those who once crossed his path. In many ways, the files became his immortality. The cultural icon. Roy has also become a cultural figure, immortalized in books, plays, and television. Tony Kushner's Angels in America portrayed him as a closeted, ruthless villain, raging against death even as AIDS consumed him. Documentaries dissect his life, podcasts recount his schemes, historians debate his legacy. He is remembered not for kindness, not for brilliance, but for ruthlessness. For the way he embodied the darkest instincts of power. The genius of darkness. Was Roy Cohn a genius? In a way, yes. He understood something fundamental about America. That law is not just about justice, that politics is not just about ideals, that business is not just about profit. All of them are about leverage. And leverage comes from fear. Roy knew how to find the crack in a man's armor, how to press it until he broke. He knew that secrets were more dangerous than guns. And he built an empire on that knowledge. But genius, when wielded without conscience, corrodes. It consumes the wielder as much as the victim. Roy's brilliance turned inward, leaving him paranoid, isolated, destroyed by the very fear he had spread. Closing scene of Chapter 12. Picture a darkened office, years after Roy's death. The desk is gone, the cabinets empty, the walls bare. But the air still feels heavy, as if the secrets once stored there have soaked into the plaster. Somewhere, a young lawyer reads about Roy Cohn and admires his audacity. Somewhere, a politician invokes his name as a symbol of ruthless tactics. Somewhere, a mobster mutters about the files that may or may not still exist. Roy Cohn is gone. But his ghost remains, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in the halls of power. A dark genius whose legacy is not justice, not truth, but fear. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Roy Cohn. Fear outlives flesh. Secrets outlive men. And the most dangerous lawyer America ever produced still whispers from the grave, reminding us that power, once seized, never truly dies.